Now tonight, I'm going to be continuing. I know, sorry, it's a bit of the Gav show up here, just kind of aligned that way, but that's what you get. Tonight we continue a series on the Gospel of John. This is a great series. I've been really enjoying it. It's only been a couple of weeks so far, but it's been great with what Dave Clark was able to share last week with Jesus turning water into wine, and I kind of did what they call the prologue in week 1 as we looked at chapter 1. And today we journey into chapter 2. And some activity of Jesus that initially can strike us as quite bizarre, but at the same time, once we start to understand what's actually going on below the surface, we realise that there's profound truths at play here that, to be honest, at the time, the people around Jesus just simply weren't getting. And that's not uncommon in the book of John. We'll discover as we head through this series, there's a whole lot of stuff that Jesus says and a whole lot of stuff that Jesus does that completely goes over the head of the first listeners. And actually tonight's a beautiful little reflection on that, because what we actually get to dive into is both a story of what Jesus did and how people responded, but also a story of what Jesus did and the realization that the author, the writer of the gospel, learned after everything had come to pass. We get this beautiful double perspective in this story today, and one that we can certainly learn from ourselves. But before we kind of head into the text, this morning I had this, I suppose, an unexpected encounter in some ways. It wasn't that the interaction itself was unexpected. It was just a story emerged that took me by surprise. Or perhaps the response of this person to their story took me by surprise. I was dropping someone off at church this morning. I went to pick them up and all that kind of stuff. And as we were in the car, we started talking about school experiences. You know, what it was like growing up, and, you know, it wasn't a long drive. I mean, we live in Alice Springs after all, but somehow we got deep fast, and that just happened. And this person was sharing with me about how going through school, that had a really, really tough time, that they had been bullied, as had been one of their sisters, and how that impacted them, how that had really hurt them growing up. But what struck me about this conversation was the way that this person was sharing it wasn't with a sense of bitterness or a sense of dread. There was a real sense of hurt there, a significance of that moment. But they ended up framing it this way, and this is what took me by surprise. Maybe you've had a similar encounter in the past. They said, you know what, even though it was hard, it's weird, but I'm actually kind of grateful for it now. I'm like, what? Because they said, well, now when I look back at it, at that experience, while it was not good at the time and while it was hurting and while there was pain involved, I look back at it now and I realize how it helped me become strong. And that wasn't initially what happened, you know, like it wasn't just like I got bullied and I got strong. You know, there was a journey involved, there was healing involved, but they looked back and they said, yeah, had I not had that experience, I don't think I would have built the strength and resilience and the hope and the certainty of who I am that I carry today. And this wasn't some sort of naive response. This wasn't kind of like, I'm going to pretend like it wasn't a big deal. This was a genuine sense of there was something that happened that was painful, that was, you might say, to use some of the language of tonight, it was death-like, sin-like, right? Broken-like. And yet, upon reflection, upon healing, this person had a deep conviction that God had used it. Not that he wanted it to happen, that's very important, but that he nevertheless used it to bring healing, strength, and restoration to this person. And it's amazing how you can go, something that is so broken, hurt, death-like can bring life. Like, it doesn't make sense to the human consciousness, certainly to those who don't know Jesus. And yet, this truth of life coming out of death is actually an echo that occurs all the way through John and profoundly occurs in this chapter. In perhaps what would be a surprising circumstance, which is Jesus overturning the tables in the temple. So if you've got your Bible with me, turn to chapter 2. We're going to look at 2 verses 13 to 25 tonight. We're going to unpack that as we look at what Jesus is up to in the temple. Here we go. I've got it on the screen in case you don't have it. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. Now, the temple, of course, was supposed to be the house of God. The understanding, particularly in Judaism, was that God's dwelling was in his temple, and this was consistent throughout the Torah, the Old Testament passages, from the tabernacle to the temple. So this is a well-understood principle that God resided here in some significant and profound way. Now, particularly as New Covenant Christians, we recognize that God's presence, right, it extends far beyond a physical dwelling. But nevertheless, this was the understanding at the time. It's important to understand. So, this is Jesus. He made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." And we're just going to pause it there. Okay, so this is a really interesting passage, and we get the account of Jesus clearing the temple several times in both the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and also in John. In fact, in Matthew, there are two accounts of him clearing the temple. It's almost like he did it once at the beginning and the people didn't learn their lesson later on. But nevertheless, this is actually quite unique in John's account, because what do we got Jesus whipping up there? You know, it wasn't like he kind of called up Etsy and said, "Hey, I need a whip," or something like that. He's kind of like, he's come into the temple and he's made a whip. Now, I don't know about you, does that seem a little bit not Jesus-like to you? When you think about how you understand Jesus, like Jesus, like just making a whip? And it raises all sorts of these other questions, like, were the people watching him make that whip? Did they know what he was about to do? Were they looking at Jesus going, "Oh, that guy's making a whip. I wonder what he's going to do with it." You know, like, it raises all sorts of, like, how long does it take to make a whip? You know, like, it raises all sorts of questions about this whip construction. But of course, that isn't the point. And it's fascinating that even as you journey through various commentaries, you find people trying to justify Jesus' apparent violent behavior, this whip creation. I was like, he didn't actually whip the people, he only whipped the animals, or, you know, he only spoke to the people. And they're all kind of like cutting in and out of this whole like, oh, you know, we can't have Jesus wielding the whip. But the truth is that it wasn't about the whip, okay? The whip was just a symbol. It was a symbol, and Jesus was stepping into a long line of prophets throughout the Old Testament who had used symbols to help signify and almost dramatize the message of God that he wanted to speak. We had people in the Old Testament, prophets in the Old Testament, kind of doing all these symbolic prophetic acts. They'd take pots and they'd break them. They'd literally burn their own excrement outside the gate. Like, it was crazy stuff. And you're kind of like, what? It's because there was a message that needed to be sent, right? And it wasn't just about the words, it was about the tools that they used to communicate this message. So while the whip was a tool, it's okay if it feels like Jesus was coming across a little violent here. I promise you there is much more going on. Notice this in verse 17. His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Now that idea of being consumed, once again, can lead us to interpret a passage of like, oh man, Jesus is just consumed with zeal. He's not in control. He doesn't know what he's up to. But actually, that's not where this comes from. You'll notice that in your text notes, it has a little footnote as to where that reference is from. And you need to understand that Jesus, first and foremost, was clearing the temple as a prophetic act, as a message-filled act. And this reference, "Zeal for your house will consume me," sometimes quoted in the subtext, "concern for God's house will be my undoing," very different meaning there, right? Comes from Psalm 69, 8-9, where the psalmist writes, "I'm a foreigner to my own family." Now just take a moment just to reflect upon these words and how Jesus must have felt in the temple of God, a place that was supposed to represent the Father's heart and his presence, where there's people who are supposedly religious, pious, selling animals, exchanging money, turning it into a marketplace. "I am a foreigner to my own family, a stranger in my own mother's children. For zeal for your house consumes me, and the insults of those who insult you fall on me." Okay? And so there's this sense in which Jesus recognized that there is going to be consequence, right, for being on the outer. It's like my position here doesn't align with how everyone else is acting and how they're going to behave. And so this position that I'm taking, this stance that I'm taking, this action that I am taking is going to put me over and against these other people who won't understand. I'm like a foreigner to them. And ultimately, taking this stance may cost me everything. Concern for God's house will be my undoing, for those who the insults of those who insult you, God, will fall upon me. And so this wasn't about violence, this prophetic act, or being consumed by anger or passion. This was about Jesus recognizing the consequences of such a prophetic act. It's like to stand against what has taken place is going to come at a cost, and we know that it did. There's going to be times, even in our own lives, where we recognize that we need to take a stand for something and it's going to come at a cost, right? Zeal for this position is going to consume me. Zeal for this position may be my undoing. But we know we've got to. And so it's a challenge for each of us, even at face value, to consider what does it look like for us to embrace that same kind of boldness that Jesus had, not in a way that is unnecessarily violent, but in a way that recognizes the cost of standing up for what is true and important. It continues of how Jesus overturned the tables. It says he made a whip out of cords, drove them all from the temple courts, the sheep and the cattle, and he scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. Now again, and for those of you who don't love Greek, I'm sorry for this, but for those of you who love it, then you'll love this. But interestingly, in John, the Greek word that's used for overturned here is a different word to that which is used in Mark and Matthew and Luke. You see, in Mark chapter 11, and I've spoken on this before in another sermon, the word to overturn is the word catastropho or catastropho, which is where we get the word catastrophe, right? Catastrophic. And so there's this sense in which I need to overturn something. I need to plow up the soil to see what is underneath. Sometimes we need some catastrophe, right, to be shaken a little to know what is true, right? And so that is the Greek word that's used in Mark and Matthew and Luke. But here in John, they use a different word, anatrepo, which means to overturn. Again, that's why it's translated as such. But beneath that, it also means to destroy or to subvert. Subvert. It's like there is something subversive, there is something that doesn't make sense that is happening under the surface here, right? That is going to take you by surprise. And so John, in his depiction of this prophetic act of Jesus, is wanting to emphasize the parallels that are about to be presented. Namely, that later in this passage, Jesus invites them to destroy the temple, which he would argue they were already doing, and then foreshadowing the subversive act that would be resurrection. That's what's going on here, okay? He's introducing this idea of resurrection, and it's profound. And yet it's so easy to miss. Let's continue. The Jews then responded to him after he had done this prophetic act. What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this? Authority is a theme that will continue to emerge in the book of John. Jesus answered them, destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days. They replied, it has taken 46 years to build this temple and you are going to raise it in 3 days? But the temple he had spoken of was his body. I've lost control. There you go. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. I love this, right? Because this is where we start to hear the two different voices. Jesus says something really bold, destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. And you can see that the people in the temple, right, the people who have just been offended, they're confused. They're like, what? Raise it in 3 days, rebuild it in three days. It's taken 46 years to build this temple and you say you can raise it in 3 days. It's like they're treating this statement of Jesus at this kind of superficial level. Don't know what's going on, but Jesus is doing something subversive here. Right? He's doing something subversive. He's overturning something here, right, in the Greek. Because as the author notes, the temple he had spoken of was not the physical temple. This was about his body. You see, the Greek word here for raise can mean a whole lot of things. It can mean to wake up, it can mean to stand up or lift up an animal, it can mean to construct something. And of course, this word, I will raise it again in 3 days, can of course be translated as resurrection. Do you believe that there's a God who nevertheless can bring resurrection out of that hurt? There might be a relationship that you have invested a significant amount of time in and it just feels hopeless. It's like, I'm not making any progress here, and you're tempted to give up because you've come to the limits of your humanity. And yet God just maybe wants to remind you tonight that He can be the resurrection in that circumstance. And yes, it may take some sacrifice. But that is the nature of His kingdom. Jesus says in John 11, I am the resurrection and the life. So let's just take a minute to consider, what is it that needs resurrection in your life? And will you trust God with it?